I'm making a video game with underwater mechanics.
In this devlog, improved minimap, Steam Next Fest feedback, credits minigame, final level revamp, achievements, enemy updates, audio effects, player effects, playtest feedback. Since the credits contain about 50 items a player needs to interact with, I decided to have them show up in the minimap somehow. To avoid having to set the reference in 25 places, I decided to give scriptable events a shot. This architecture is based on a video by Mooniz. I started by making a scriptable object that would raise the event and expose an action things can register on. Then I made a script that would just log out the state to the console. With that working, I made a script on the minimap camera to toggle the camera on and off based on the event. With the framework in place, I continued with completing the credits minigame. In order to show the names on the minimap, I added a script to one of the texts that enables a star icon when the minimap is visible. I wanted to add all playtesters to the credits, so I worked on a script that would download all existing boards to a directory. With the data downloaded, I could compute unique names across all boards and place them in a different file. Since the names are different sizes, I worked out how big the collider for a name has to be to barely fit the name. This simply uses a text preferred bounds and rounds the values to the ceiling. This becomes the size of the box collider. In order to avoid having to manually place all of them, I added the ability for each text to shuffle itself with a button press. These player names will use the common particle effect, so I made a button to generate those game objects for me since there's 50 of them. That generation showed me that the level was a tad small, so I made it big enough to fit most names comfortably. With the names fitting and shuffled, I just had to do a little bit of manual adjustment to get them correctly. Having the right setup in the credits, I also updated the rest of the mini-maps to show icons. I started by just making the chest and player display the same sprite. The original size I picked felt too big on small maps. After much tinkering and debating, I opted for a smaller size and just having the player icon. Last devlog, I mentioned some changes I wanted to make to the final level, so I worked on that next. I started by fixing the shipwreck section, working on a long mast for a vertical section. I wasn't a fan of the barriers and opted for an open vertical section, but using the jellyfish and crabs to form obstacles based on their movements. For the coral castle section, I edited the tower to contain some of the diagonal angles featured in that world. The temple section changed to a 2-floor setup without multiple entrances. The quetzals here are configured to launch faster than in other levels. As usual, before setting up art, I had to beat the level in its blockout form without getting hit. With that check passing, I then focused on reworking the collider and filler tiles. Then I added the decorations to the new sections. Final step as usual, I had to beat the level in its art complete stage. This level making pipeline worked great throughout development and helped me tweak things even when the art was mostly done. Adding Steam achievements was something I wanted to get to eventually, and here we are. Since I use Heathen for leaderboards, I looked at their doc on setting up achievements. After defining a test achievement and importing it, I built a button that would grant it using that object. Using the same framework for events, I defined a few events that would be used to derive achievements. Then I made a test listener that subscribed to those events. This clip shows an event firing when you lose the game. One of the original achievements required listening to the result of a leaderboard, so I worked on adding that. I eventually scrapped this event since it required becoming rank 1 on any board, and I could see that causing problems. Since Steam rate limits updating achievements, I built a game object similar to the leaderboard synchronizer. In-game events are fired as they happen, and achievements are updated but not sent to Steam until an appropriate time. One of the achievements only applies based on difficulty, so I checked that worked correctly. While I worked on all of this, the game's demo was live at Steam Next Fest. I got some good feedback out of it that I addressed. A common piece of feedback players gave involved trying to recover a chest right below you. I started by adding a long invincibility buffer when you pick a chest underneath you. Then I tweaked the invincibility time so it wasn't too obvious but also not forgiving enough. This took a lot of trial and error. Here's what the final timing looks like. Without the debug UI, you can hardly tell I helped you at all. Players also reported that the chest shows up through objects when being held by a player. I originally intended this as a feature so you never lost sight of the chest. This fix just required setting the chest to be on the same layer as the player but in front, since props are in a higher layer than the player already. A player reported weird lines at a higher resolution than 1920 by 1080. Fortunately, I was able to reproduce this in Editor without having to change my monitor settings. The last time I had this bug, I solved it by making sure none of the maps were below the origin in a scene. This seemed to fix it again. I think a final fix I can try if this shows up is making sprite atlases for all the tiles. Another report I received pointed out that the anemones will glitch out when you get hit sometimes. This one was caused by having no sorting order on these, so they're all resorting at depth 0 when the screen shakes. A major piece of feedback I received was that throwing was wildly inconsistent, which was something I felt too, but left until now. The throw mechanic didn't really throw the chest, it just placed it in front. I started this new version by defining an angle the chest should be thrown at and visualizing that in the engine. While moving, this angle-based approach was still inconsistent with very wild results sometimes. Looking at how the old behavior functioned, I realized the problem is while moving, sometimes the player collides with the chest mid-throw. I tried a lot of things here, from orchestrating collision layers to adding extra force parameters. Using the player's velocity in some fashion and shifting where the throw starts at gave me slightly better results. I then played with how much velocity the chest inherits. A value of 0.6 let me juggle the chest while running, but throw it far enough while walking. A minor change I made was setting the Y velocity to 0 before re-enabling the chest collider. I think part of my problem was the chest begins to fall before I even throw it. While I was touching the chest's behavior, I also included some drag on the chest. Players had reported that the chest felt too weighty when carrying, but didn't look so when pushed around. Here's how the final values look when you walk and sprint while throwing the chest. Players felt that the eels and coral castles were slightly too hard to pass through sometimes. I tweaked the first set of alternating eels and increased the time for each animation. To make this easier, I updated the eels gizmo to display a distance metric between eels. This let me align the distances when alternating between sides. This inconsistency explained why it felt this trap setup was easier based on which side started first. Knowing there was a distance where things were too hard, I made another metric style object to ballpark eels that needed tweaking. This metric and the distance gizmo were super useful to see how much space there was when an eel was fully extended. A player discovered a sweet spot in level 6 where you can get between a pufferfish and an eel. While editing the distances, I ensured the sweet spot still existed since it requires player skill to find and use. Level 6 received a lot of tweaks, so I had to ensure I could still beat it without getting hit. While editing these levels, I also gave more consistency to the coral shape so the map didn't look so empty. A few months ago, Hooch threw an idea at me to improve performance on a different game object. The Quetzals in level 6 caused some performance dips since they're fast-moving polygon colliders. Since it worked in other regions, I gave that a shot with this enemy type. Performance seemed to improve, so I kept that logic. I tested this out with the rotating spikes, and things were actually worse, so I didn't change those. A user reported that the crabs can push the chest out of bounds and then you can't recover them. I thought I could solve this by simply changing the body from static to dynamic, so all physics things happen correctly. This definitely was not it. Since I used the transform to move positions, I updated my code to use rigid body movement. This required changing to use do-tween to move things properly. With things moving via physics, I expected the chest to sort of prevent the crab from moving automatically. Here the chest at least snaps back into position, but it can still get shoved out. Next thing I tried was making the crab stop as soon as it touched the chest. Somehow doing that translates to a huge force on the chest. With a little bit of tweaking, I ended up being able to reduce the velocity sent to the chest. I still wasn't happy with how this behaved. Part of my patrol code handles rotating sprites. This had an unintentional side effect with crabs that move diagonally and vertically. I updated that logic to continue trying to patrol a crab to the desired destination before it rotates at that position. This still was iffy and could mess with the synchronized timing between traps. A different approach I tried was using a raycast to check if a chest is going to block movement before the crab moves to the next position. I showed this off on Discord and someone suggested having the crab intentionally steal a chest instead and being able to steal it back. This felt much better. The crabs had a problem holding onto the chest when it was moving, since the velocity isn't set to 0 properly. Resetting the velocity to 0 when the crab takes possession of it fixes that problem. I still had to fix the rotation part in this clip. Next problem I had to solve was not being able to go through the chest collider when the player takes damage. This ended up causing me to be pushed out of bounds. I tried just making the player not collide with the chest while they were invulnerable, but that had other problems while you stay in the crab's damage area. Lots of tweaking later, things finally behaved right. The next problem to solve was figuring out a sweet spot to be able to stand on the chest and steal the chest while the crab is moving without taking damage. Eventually, I found a good enough value that lets you recover the chest in any position with some careful movement. A piece of feedback I received a while ago was a desire for alternate bindings. I didn't want to try to handle multiple bindings in one action, so I copy-pasted the actions and added an alt prefix to them. Since most of my binding logic assumes a single key for an action, doing it this way made most things work out of the box. I then had to update the text for the tutorials to also display the alternate bindings. I also updated the keybinds at the end of the tutorial. Other pieces of feedback involved the dialog system. The first improvement was configuring both space and click to also work for continuing the conversation. The next area to tackle was the conversation between the tutorial and first level feeling awkward when you skip the tutorial, so I fixed that as well. The tutorial received additional updates, mostly around the hints panel. Since I added this later in development, it doesn't really consider any other state on the UI. With the minimap event framework in place, I hooked up the UI to hide when the minimap is up. I also made it hide when the pause menu is visible. The return portion of the tutorial felt empty, so I simply made the empty section repeat the return to the anchor message. With all of these improvements, I made a build and submitted it for Steam review. The first build failed, so I worked on addressing the feedback for it. The first action item was that the Steam overlay doesn't pause the game. It was hard to do this in Editor, so I made a button fire a custom event to emulate the behavior. I added my own glass pane effect in case a player has the Steam overlay up, switches tabs, and forgets why the game is paused. I found a bug where the canvas does not properly disable all buttons when it is made non-interactable by the overlay code. Looking online, I found a solution that suggested just disabling the input system module on the event system to prevent navigation on the UI. With that behavior working, I then made game managers ensure the game is paused when the overlay event is received. For consistent behavior, I updated the force pause logic on the world map as well. As a final test, I had to try this in a build outside of Unity for the Steam overlay to properly display. Since I effectively fire my own event when the overlay event is received, all things worked correctly. The next key point to address was the game needed to pause when a controller is disconnected. This logic reuses portions of the Steam overlay fix. The game will pause and wait for the controller to be reconnected or the player to use the keyboard. A non-blocking action item was the mouse cursor not hiding when using a gamepad only. At first this seemed like an easy fix, just manipulating the cursor state based on the active device. Since that worked, I also hit the cursor when the gameplay action map was active, even when using the keyboard. While testing, I noticed that the cursor would often reappear in the middle of the screen randomly. Apparently this is a Unity bug that's been persistently showing on and off. So I decided a good compromise was to just hide the cursor when the player starts moving with the keyboard. This works for most instances, but sometimes reappears. With all of those action items addressed, I submitted the build for review again. This time, the build passed and I finally saw the green button. With that out of the way, it was time to add a lot of polish. One of the requests from NextFest was to display the name of the level on the leaderboard's view. I started by rearranging the layout and making space for the name. For consistency, I gave every board type a scroll pane, even if only 8 records will display for the global panels. Then I worked on making the title bar update based on the level name enum that I have in the game. With that working, I updated that logic to consider the localized name for a world. When I added the logic for trying to re-upload scores, I made a card to explore displaying a disclaimer about that logic. I added the disclaimer panel to the first time you press dive in, just so players don't worry when a score upload fails. I spent some time adding more audio effects to actions other than the player. The first one came from a request from Hooch so a player could tell when a chest made it to the anchor when the anchor is off camera. This sounded alright, but something was off. I found a tutorial that suggested using a low-pass filter to make things sound more underwater. I applied a filter to the original sound effect and it sounded better to me, so I went with it. Since I was updating audio effects, I found an explosion clip that worked with the mics. Then I applied the same low-pass filter trick to make it sound even more underwater. The next enemy I spruced up was the pufferfish. I copied portions of the bubble effects and played those particles when the puffer blows up. Then I gave the pufferfish its own sound effect. Since the patrol puffer stops moving, I double-checked the particle effect was parented to the right objects. The jellyfish got a set of electricity particle effects, but it would look faded depending on which direction the jellyfish went. I thought I could get around this by only playing an effect when objects enter its trigger area, but that also didn't work right. Looking at the jellyfish in a 2.5D view highlights the problem. It's the sorting layers on the effect since the jellyfish gets inverted. Flipping the jellyfish doesn't add much to this enemy, so I disabled that logic, which fixed the weird fading problem. Then I combined both effects, a consistent set of pulsing beams to warn the player, and a shock effect when damage would be dealt. Finally, I added an electricity effect I modified from a sound pack with a 24 decibel low pass filter. Adding UI effects was also on the list of things to polish. I started by making a system that plays a random clip from a set of clips when you select a button. Then I updated all of the pause panels to include these effects. Since those buttons come from separate prefabs, I couldn't just update a single button. The input binding buttons and restore buttons share a common prefab, so updating a couple of them updated those menus. I also added sounds to the anchors on the world map. I added a delay to downloading boards here since I accidentally rate limited my downloads by switching between anchors a lot. The anchor also plays a different sound when a level is locked, which is something I noticed players wouldn't realize when watching playtests. I also added sounds when the volume changes for either the effects channel, UI channel, or when you press apply. Receiving that audio feedback on actions made me add effects when you restore or rebind a control as well. I also added sounds to the leaderboard scroll bar, which I had to add a delay to since the change event fires on every increment, which sounded terrible. About 9 months ago, Christina warned me not to use the auto text button and to control my text sizes instead. I definitely listened back then and did not have a bunch of auto-sizing text all over the place, which had to be fixed now that things were localized. The first part I started making consistent was the tab sizes for the leaderboards. Since the Spanish translation for the tabs is longer, I used that for the sizing. Then I checked the individual panels, once again using the Spanish text since it's longer in most instances. Once all the panels were redone, I checked the names on the world map. These changed from the demo version since I found better ones. In retrospect, I should have used Christina's hint of assigning text mesh styles to things instead of having to go through the whole game and edit individual buttons. If you want to learn more about saving yourself from this mistake, watch Christina's tutorial on Text Mesh Pro text styles to style your text mesh text like a pro. Since losing due to a lack of oxygen has an animation, I've repurposed the vignette effect to also trigger on hit, but changed the color to red. I copied the setup from the oxygen effect, having a separate component responsible for listening to the health system and triggering on an event. For the final change, I also made a similar effect to losing the game where the vignette closes in on you. While checking how the vignette interacts when both effects activate, I found that the oxygen system doesn't stop when you die, so it's possible to get the drown animation effect when you lost already. That fix was simple, I just had to stop the right system based on the death type. After all this, I uploaded a release candidate build to Steam and played through it, addressing any bugs as I found them. That's it for this devlog. By the time you see this, the game should be released on Steam. If you've been following from the start or just happened to find this, it's been over 2 years. The game has come a long way from where it started, and a lot has changed since then. From the first bat level I ever made, to the first playable demo I released, to the point when the game actually became fun, and the point where the scope increased, to the mechanic I scrapped, to the system rewrite that broke the game, and when the game earned a reason to be replayed, to when the game became public, to my first experience having real testers, to passing a milestone I never thought I'd reach, to the game scope being finalized, to the creation of the trailer, and to the home stretch. But the one thing that never changed was the support I've received to ensure I didn't drown during development. So thank you to everyone who helped along the way. After all that, there's only one way I could end this video. I made a video game with underwater mechanics. Until next time.